Welcome to the Wounds That Do Not Heal. My name is Tressa Brady. After my own experience and hearing time and time again about domestic violence in military families, I decided to start this podcast. Tune in for stories, resources, and guidance on how to get the support you need for your family and your safety. I want you to close your eyes and think about the person in your life who's the most selfless, the one who will answer your call no matter what time, who will always show up when you're in need. She or he is that shirt off of their own back, give you their last dollar friend. You don't even need to ask because they'll offer first. For many, when they do this exercise, they would picture their friend Selena Roth. Selena was many things in her short life, but mostly she was a giver, an empath, and an advocate for those who couldn't speak for themselves. I recently listened to another podcast about Selena because when I set out to share a victim's story, what is most important to me is that I capture the essence of who they were, not just what they endured. I want to know what was most important to them and what their family members want remembered about them. Usually this means I'll spend hours researching their old social media profiles, scrolling through comments and interactions, finding old high school yearbooks, features in newspapers of their accomplishments from when they were kids or in their childhood or hometown, anything to get a little flavor and insight on who this person was. I want to truly grasp that so that I can paint an accurate picture of the victim and ensure that they're going to be remembered exactly as that and not just for the salacious details of their own demise. Details that will sadly eventually be much more accessible to the general public than the content of their character was while they were here. The podcast I listened to was called True Crime Date Night, and the hosts were a couple named Casey Whitsons and Nikki Friday. I don't believe the podcast is still active. Their last published episode was in November of 2021. However, they did a really good job and even interviewed Selena's big sister, Erin Roth. Now, this is where I was able to really learn what Selena was like as a person. I also watched several tribute videos, news stories where people gave their testimony of what they loved most about their friend Selena. And of course, I scoured her own social media pages. Everything I could get my hands on to learn more about this beautiful young woman. I learned the crime details and the legalities by accessing public court-martial records online. So please check out my show notes if you want to access those yourself. So here's what I was able to gather about Selena. When Erin described Selena with one word, she chose the word determined. Now I can remember growing up and wanting to be just like my big sister Melody, which made me constantly in a hurry to grow up. My sister was 3 years older, and so she introduced me to my first CD, Aerosmith, Get a Grip. I can still picture the CD cover. And it's still the greatest album and band of all times, if you ask me. I used to steal her Doc Martens until I could get my own first pair. And she taught me to drive a stick shift in her 1987 Ford Escort illegally in the high school parking lot when I was about 13 years old. She was just the coolest in my book. So I was in a hurry to grow up, and it made me very determined to be able to do the things my cool big sister could do. Well, Selena was like this, trying to accomplish things as fast as she could to keep up with her older siblings. But multiply that by 8, because Selena was the youngest of 9 siblings. She had a blended family. When her father, Tom, met Selena's mother, Joanne, she came with 3 daughters, Kristen, Julie, and Aubrey, who Tom would go on to adopt. Tom had 2 biological children he brought with him, Aaron and Jenny. And then together, Tom and Joanne would have what they would all lovingly refer to as the final 4, Stephanie, Michael, Joey, and then last but not least, baby Selena. And to say she was cherished is an understatement. The spread was, I believe, 21 years from oldest down to Selena. So she had a lot of older siblings to give her something to aspire to. Selena grew up with her parents, Tom and Joanne Roth, in Springfield, Florida, about an hour north of Tampa. She was always going full speed ahead. Maybe this is why, come high school, she was on all of the sports teams. She lettered in multiple varsity sports, super impressive. She was even a phenomenal musician. She was actually a very talented violinist, and she was the mistress of the local symphony, which is also called first chair or first violinist or concert master. It's a vital musical leader with responsibilities like tuning the orchestra and working closely with the conductor. She also taught violin lessons at a local magnet school. The girl must not have slept. I'm not sure how she managed it all, but motivation was not something a young Selena lacked. She was always trying to learn new things, and if she couldn't teach herself, she'd seek out someone who could teach her. She was just foot on the throttle, full speed ahead, and seemed to have just a passion and a real zest for life itself. By the time Selena was graduating high school, she actually had already completed an associate's degree from college. Her school had a program where you could dual enroll, and she was able to complete 2 years of college during her high school time while also receiving really high marks. That's insane. The fact she was holding down the position with the orchestra, lettering in multiple sports, teaching, and also during that time, she did a lot of volunteer work with animals. It was all an immense amount to undertake. Selena was on the fast track to a very successful life and never slowed down. Now, Selena came from a military family, and so upon graduation, she went and enlisted in the Army. Her father was retired Air Force, and 3 of her siblings were Navy, I believe, one still being active Navy. She also had grandparents, uncles, and numerous cousins who served. Selena always admired that and wanted to serve her country and do her part. Selena was incredibly close with her family and even had a little tattoo that read "Family First." One of the things I can't leave out is that Selena felt what was most important in the world was advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. She was a huge animal advocate and enjoyed fostering and adopting animals. She even knit little clothes for a local shelter, which is it's just, Selena was my kind of people. Her sister Erin said that even as a child, she had a really strong moral compass that wouldn't allow her to sit idly by while a person was being mistreated. She would see someone getting bullied and feel the need to intervene and defend the victim. When I looked up Selena's Facebook page, which remains active now as a memorial to her, it actually gave me chills because as a profile picture, Selena had chosen a picture of Private First Class Vanessa Guillen. It was actually her missing person flyer. Now, if you don't recall or are unaware, Private First Class Vanessa Guillen was a United States Army soldier who at just 20 years old was murdered in the armory at Fort Hood on April 20th of 2020. She was bludgeoned to death by another soldier, Aaron David Robinson. Guillen was missing for 2 months when some of her dismembered remains were found buried along the Leon River on June 30th of 2020. Later evidence would show that Aaron's girlfriend, Cecilia Aguilar, assisted in the dismemberment of Vanessa, and some of the evidence released later would show that the killer was trying to cover up harassment and sexual assault. And though Vanessa went missing in April of 2020 and was found in June of 2020, she remained Selena's profile picture long after. And on December 7th of 2020, Selena would write the following post: "Vanessa Guillen is still my profile picture, not because I'm too lazy to change it, but because what happened to her is an ongoing issue that affects us all. I don't know a single woman over 18 that hasn't been sexually assaulted, and I can guarantee you don't either. You just may not know it or what they've been through. I know it feels old. I know you're tired of this, but don't let her death go without consequence. Hashtag I'm Vanessa Guillen. Me Too Military. Never forget." And in an absolutely tragic twist of fate, just 37 days after this post, Selena would go missing herself. She would be murdered by her estranged husband, Raul Hernandez Perez, a victim of domestic violence herself. But to back up a little bit, I want to share with you more about her relationship with the man who would go on to take her life. Selena was a signals intelligence analyst in the Army. What this means is she was a 35 November who would examine and analyze foreign communications and activity to find intelligence and then relay that critical information to senior leaders by producing strategic and tactical reports based on her analysis. She would help place, camouflage, and recover surveillance equipment and identify, track, and analyze a target's operational patterns to assist leaders in formulating an attack plan. So essentially, in layman's terms, she was a little detective collecting intelligence to help determine what the enemy was doing. Selena wanted to go on to finish her bachelor's degree at some point soon and possibly even continue on with a higher education after that. Education was extremely important to her, and so it was never a question of if she would attend, but when she would attend on top of all the other excellent things that she was doing. Selena joined the military in 2017 and completed basic in May of 2017. After her basic in Texas, she was stationed in Hawaii. She married another military service member named Danny Hewitt. Now, I don't have a ton of information about their courting or marriage, but I did learn that they had a baby girl together, who we will call Baby in August of 2019. Now, the timeline's a little confusing, but it seems they'd already agreed to go their separate ways despite preparing to have a baby. I'm not sure the logistics, but what I do know is that marrying young is hard. Preparing to have a child together is hard. Moving around the country is hard. And on top of all of that, being a dual military family and trying to acclimate to a military lifestyle is a ton of stress on a young married couple. So they dissolved their marriage, and Selena had begun her relationship with a man named Raul Hernandez Perez, a fellow service member who she met while she was in Texas. Selena welcomed baby girl in August of 2019 while dating Raul, and her and Danny were co-parenting. Selena's big sister said they were getting their footing on the whole co-parenting thing and finding ways to put their little girl first. She says she was confident they would have raised a little girl really well together because they both loved their little girl more than anything. But of course, they never would get the opportunity. And nobody could have predicted it, but baby girl N would only know her mother's love until she was a little over a year old. And I did stumble upon a few news clips where Danny discusses what a great mother Selena was and that he will raise his little girl to know that her mother was a caring, wonderful mother and an advocate for animals and humans. Now, Selena's family would share that they had some reservations about Raul from the start. Some of the family members had met him when they'd gone to Hawaii to meet baby girl N after her birth. Others had multiple interactions with him on FaceTime and phone conversations that left them less than enthralled being with their beloved Selena. They'd felt that Selena had always been a very confident, outgoing, strong-minded, and even somewhat spicy woman. And yet with Raul, she seemed to cater to him and not necessarily share her own thoughts and opinions in an effort to keep him appeased. Selena married Raul in January of 2020. A very quick dating and marriage, but this is super common in the military. If you're unmarried and a lower-ranking military service member, you have to live on base and are subject to all the rules on base, so this will encourage people to marry quicker. Or if you're married, you can move off base and get a decent basing housing allowance, money for dependents. There's a lot of perks to being married. Additionally, if you're a young person, you may want someone waiting back home for you if you deploy. I'm sure that can motivate some people to marry along with all the other benefits like insurance and so on. So for these reasons and more, we see military marriages occur very quickly sometimes after a couple starts dating. So the Roth family would report that Raul and Selena did have very heated arguments, but that there was no history of violence that they were aware of. I do want to remind you, though, that statistically, physical violence is not the top predictor of whether or not an abuser will kill their victim, but rather being coercively controlling is the top predictor. And Raul was definitely that. He would reel Selena in and play mind games and control her, and that's a very dangerous thing. This often causes victims to change so many things about themselves in an attempt to try and stay on their abuser's good side. To me, a survivor of an abusive relationship, this is so familiar. When you're dealing with the repercussions of any disagreements with an abuser, you bend and compromise yourself to keep them from getting angry. Your boundaries get moved more and more, and it's a grooming process. You may keep your inner thoughts and opinions entirely to yourself because you learn that expressing any difference of opinion from your abuser will very often result in an angry explosion on their part. Early on, something that would have upset you now causes you no reaction whatsoever. Your abuser has done a calculated job of increasing your tolerance for their abuse, and eventually you're just numb to the abuse and agree with whatever they say to keep the peace and keep their anger at bay. Say, for example, you're traditionally a very jovial and spirited and outgoing person, but this could be a trigger for your abuser. So you may start to modify your behavior and tell yourself to be just a bit quieter around him. Maybe don't seem so perky or outgoing because you want to keep him satisfied. And this behavior modification is insidious and leaks into every aspect of your life until those closest to you don't recognize you. In discussions I had with a psychologist, she said if you're looking for signs of abuse in a marriage, that very often the abuser is so talented at hiding their instability and abusive side that you have to look more at the spouse to see changes in them. If they're changing the way they dress, changing their demeanor to cater to someone else, maybe not wanting to go out in public as much, those are all signs of intimate partner abuse. If their opinions are changing or they can't make a decision or even decide what their opinion is, that can be a red flag. The abuser might be very good at putting on a fake face to all of those around them, so they seem totally normal, while the victim becomes less recognizable. I actually remember coming out of my abusive relationship, having a hard time remembering what I even liked for a little while. I was just in a state of numbness. Now, at some point early on in the marriage, Selena found out that Raul was trying to rekindle a romance with an ex-girlfriend. She discovered him cheating, and so this caused a great deal of strife. At one point, when Selena discovered cheating, she tossed Raul's PlayStation out of the house, an act that would have him accuse her of being the abuser and psychologically abusing him in order to obtain a legal no contact order against her. In October of 2020, Selena would share with her family that her and Raul would be getting a divorce, and this came as a relief to the family. They hoped that the Selena they knew and loved would be restored to herself once Raul was out of the picture. However, once that divorce was announced, people started to see more and more of the toxic and abusive behavior that Selena had been subjected to. One of the reasons I wanted to tell this story again, even though the podcast I mentioned did a really good job of sharing the case, is because I do have experience as the survivor of intimate partner abuse. So some of the things that were shared about Selena and Raul's relationship, the host of the show was really surprised by it. And she kept reiterating how confusing the behaviors were and asking Selena's sister if it made any sense to her. It didn't seem like she had any experience with intimate partner abuse, which is great, fantastic. I don't want her to have had to endure that. But that's the section of the story I want to pull back the curtain on, because it's so baffling to an outsider. And even just listening to that podcast, she's like, does this make any sense? But for me on my end, I was nodding my head going, yep, that's his next move. Yep, of course that's what he's did. Of course, exactly what an abuser would do. So there's a pattern looking at the timeline that I see leading up to Selena's death, and it's a very familiar pattern. Raul had filed the no contact order against Selena that I before mentioned. And if you're not in the military, just a side note, no contact orders in the military, it's a directive issued to prevent zero contact between individuals in the military, often due to allegations of harassment, abuse, or violence. So it's similar to a restraining order in the civilian world, but it's issued by a military member's command. The order is very often just verbal, ordered immediately to cease any communication with a specific person or person while the commander investigates and evaluates the situation. So commanders, first shirts, first sergeants, anyone with a higher rank than the recipient of the no contact order can issue a no contact order. Now, because both Selena and Raul were military, both could be susceptible to this. Now, I'll tell you, when I tried to get one against my ex, I called his first shirt at his base and begged for protection because he was stalking me. And the commander was like, yep, you got it. No contact order issued now. That same day, he was still stalking me and I reported it and nothing happened to reprimand him. And I don't know if this is because he was special forces or what have you, but we see different levels of response for all of these, which is why we're here, right? So the pattern that we saw was Raul had the no contact order, but he would then seek out Selena, even though he had the no contact order, and show up at her house and be the one making contact. And then he would turn around and call and report her for breaching that no contact order. And this is a prime example of post-separation abuse, a tactic in which the victim of abuse has left or is out of the situation trying to leave their abuser, but the abuse ramps up so much and it escalates to such an unbearable amount of just trauma that sometimes that victim will just give up because that post-separation abuse is so terrible. And sometimes that abuse even means legal reprimands for the victim. The victim will be accused of being the abuser. And then the victim just gives up. That abuse is so stressful. But Selena just wanted to make this second marriage work. And so it seems she would always forgive Raul and then see him. But then he would go on and report her for breaching that no contact order. And actually at one point while he was on her property, he notified the military that the no contact order was breached. And they actually came, the military police, and took Selena into custody. And that actually resulted in her little girl being placed in the custody of Child Welfare Services, which may have actually been a blessing in disguise. We'll talk about that later. So this pattern continued on. And at one point, Selena filed a no contact order against Raul as well. But Raul would continue to give Selena hope. He would give her just enough to think that maybe they could work it out. I think kind of like somewhat of a version of breadcrumbing, a manipulative technique where a person gives another just enough attention and communication to keep them interested and involved, but without actually committing to the relationship. So Selena and Raul had filed for divorce in October, just 10 months after marrying. And he'd had affairs prior and then moved on, yet was keeping that hope alive in Selena, and that door cracked just enough for her to keep letting him get back in. Perhaps this was for his own sexual needs, perhaps just because he could. Perhaps in case his other relationship fell through, he wanted Selena there because he couldn't stand to be alone. Who knows why people do this? It's disgusting. But Selena was just a young mom who wanted desperately to make her marriage work, and he exploited that. And it would seem that on the 1-year anniversary of Selena and Raul's marriage, that nostalgia and emotions would get the best of her. Because on January 8th of 2020, Raul would come over to Selena's house and spend the night. Then on the 9th, their 1-year anniversary, the pair would spend the entire day together celebrating, as if they weren't going through a contentious divorce and both under no contact orders. And now I'm sure to many listeners, this seems just nonsensical. But you have to realize in these abusive relationships, there's a power dynamic. The victim has been groomed to just subside and cave to the requests and pressures of the abuser. So I believe when Raul wanted to hang out for their anniversary, Selena was given a glimmer of hope that maybe she could still save her marriage. The two would go to the movies that day and be seen walking throughout the mall holding hands. They had lunch together and then they'd end the day at Selena's on-base home, a place Raul was not allowed to be. That night, Raul would testify that he and Selena had sex at her home, and then he made an excuse to sleep there, saying he was too tired to go back to his own place on base. In the early hours of January 10th, as Selena lay sleeping, Raul went to her computer where he Googled, "How many times do you need to hit someone with a bat before they are dead?" He then went downstairs and grabbed a bat before he went and struck Selena as she laid in her bed again and again. When he saw her stirring and realized she was still alive, Raul then went back downstairs and got a knife from her kitchen. He stabbed Selena until he was sure she was dead. He then went back to her computer and Googled to find out when her trash day was. He would bring a large rolling dumpster inside her front door and wrap Selena in her own bedding and dispose of her in that dumpster. And then he went about his normal life. He returned to work and acted as if nothing had occurred. He didn't mention Selena or that she was missing nor show any concern for her when others did. During this time, Selena's family grows very concerned as they're usually in constant communication with her daily. So they called and requested a welfare check. Military police would locate Selena during that welfare check in a trash receptacle on January 13th, 3 days after Raul had carelessly tossed her in that dumpster, like her life didn't matter. A later video would show Hernandez Perez disposing of items in a trash on barracks outside his own home on January 10th. So it didn't take police hardly any time to zero in on him, and Hernandez Perez would confess. Now, Raul did many cruel things to her in addition to causing her child to be taken into custody, but her family actually considered that a blessing, as I mentioned, because since she was in protective custody on the day her mother was murdered, it meant that she wasn't harmed, because who knows what Raul Hernandez Perez would have done to her had she been in the home. But in his final cruel acts, Raul would go on to take a plea deal in court where he would then testify to murdering her. However, he would paint her as the abuser. He would perjure himself on the stand and lie about who she was and ultimately fault her for her own death. He would act as if she drove him to it and even testified that on the morning of January 10th, when he woke up, he decided she must die. He must kill her for what she put him through. He even concocted a story about how she'd threatened to kill his mother, what he recalled as the final tipping point. Now, if you've ever been with an abuser like this, I can tell you these types of people are master manipulators, and they can make anything fit their narrative. Pathological liars. She may have said something off the cuff. Her family said she was really passionate, but she would never threaten to kill someone. But I can imagine a scenario when discussing his mother where she was like, ugh, I could kill her. And we've all said things like that in jest, like, ugh, my mom just gave candy canes to the kids before bedtime. I'm going to kill her. Something equally unintentionally aggressive, joking. But if this were to happen with someone like a Raul Hernandez Perez, they will use this and twist it into their own narrative, and they will act as if it justified their actions. Well, she was planning on killing my mother, so I had no choice. But I don't believe it for 1 second. At the end of the day, Selena Roth's life was taken from her because of a selfish, abusive man who wanted to dominate her. Ultimately, Raul Hernandez Perez was sentenced to 62 years in jail with a few months for disobeying a no-contact order. But no matter how long he spends in jail, he will never be able to give back what Selena's family has lost, what her daughter has lost in a mother, what her daughter's father has lost in a co-parent, what the world has lost with the passion that she had to give, the determination and advocacy. She contributed so much to this world in her young life. I can only imagine how many lives she was going to change. Now, Hernandez Perez does have the option to get parole in 10 years, and from everything I read, that's highly unlikely, but God forbid. Now, I've been contacted by multiple victims of domestic violence in military families to share their story, and I've also been contacted by people who've been victims of sexual assault and military sexual trauma while they were serving in the military by other service members. So I've decided I will also be doing a series of this podcast where I focus on those stories, and I will be dedicating this series to Selena Roth. I know Selena was extremely passionate about advocating for people who were victims of sexual assault and military sexual trauma. And I do believe that if she were around, she'd be advocating for these people. So I intend to take that baton from Selena and carry that advocacy for her. And I think if you'd like to honor Selena, you could donate to your favorite animal welfare group in her name or support victims of sexual assault and MST maybe in her name. And if you'd like to have your story shared on this show, it can be anonymous if you like. You can always email me at healingwounds13@gmail.com. The next time you see someone out there fighting for women's rights or rescuing an animal or just being a really good person, please think of Selena Roth. Thank you for listening, and please stay safe. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you think this content would be helpful for someone you know, please share the link with them. Sources can be found in the show notes of today's episode.